Guys ready for the last little piece and last little set of presentation before we break out into some discussion groups? The interesting part about this last set of presentations is that every single person for this section is in person. So thank you all for being here in person. Appreciate it. So talking about the reforestation pipeline capacity, we're going to turn it over to Josh Sloan, who's going to talk to us about the New Mexico Reforestation Center.
Sure. I'm not helping. All right, and it's just arrows for the slides?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for everyone, and thank you to the organizers for getting everybody together for this. We're going to be shifting gears here for my talk, and let me clock myself because 7 minutes is going to be challenging for me. So shifting from the research, we want to talk about an example of how we are actually right now scaling reforestation capacity in a very real way in the Southwest. And I want to talk a little bit about, the challenges we ran into with that and how this might serve as a model for replication or adaptation in other regions. Yeah, so know a lot of you. Joshua Sloan with New Mexico Highlands University, based in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and along with several colleagues. So Matt Hurteau that's here, Laura McCarthy, who's the state forester in New Mexico, and Owen Burney with New Mexico State University. We got together around 2019 when the state was developing its new forest action plan to be the 2020 forest action plan. State forester Laura McCarthy wanted us to figure out how to address the state's reforestation needs. What we came up with was the New Mexico Reforestation Center. And then that was officially founded in 2022 and is well underway at this point. So it was founded by 4 partners. Like I mentioned, they're the State Forestry Division, New Mexico State University, New Mexico Highlands University, and then University of New Mexico. And the mission is simple: to meet current and future reforestation needs in New Mexico and the Southwest. We very intentionally wanted to do that across the pipeline and adopt a whole pipeline approach to capacity building. And as folks are thinking about how to adapt the conversations today and how to troubleshoot things to incorporate everything in the reforestation module for the Planscape tool, I absolutely want to encourage everybody this afternoon and after this meeting to think about that whole pipeline approach. Absolutely be thinking about scaling in parallel your seed, your nursery capacity, and your planting monitoring capacity, and closing that adaptive feedback, adaptive management loop. That's going to be critical, and that's something, that's been a fundamental principle for us in the Southwest. So we also intentionally designed our operations, partnering with the State Forestry Division, who has the Good Neighbor Authority Agreement with the Forest Service, so that we would be able to operate on any ownership, using any money, working with any partners. And again, I think that's something critical for folks to be thinking about as you're trying to design some sort of integrated reforestation planning platform, is, think about how you can design your operations, your planning tools to adapt themselves to each of those ownership specific sets of constraints, or at least recognize them and figure out creative workarounds like we've had to do. In terms of capacity, what we've been building with New Mexico Reforestation Center. So this is going to be like I mentioned, whole pipeline reforestation center, seed to seedlings to planting. The physical infrastructure that we're actually hoping to break ground on later this summer is going to be built around a 5 million seedling capacity nursery, all new construction, going to have its own extractory, its own seed bank, its own research facilities attached to it. And all told, it's going to be close to $100 million facility that we're building there. And like I mentioned, breaking ground this summer and going to be open for business looking at 2028. In terms of operations, we're going to focus a little more as I get to the next slide and talking about some of this on the seed side of it, which is really my area. I have focused mostly at Highlands University and with the Reforestation Center on building seed capacity and extraction and seed banking capacity, as well as workforce development. And right now, we just finished renovating a building on my campus to serve as New Mexico's de facto seed extractory for the state. We just ran our first crop of cones through our extractory, pulled in about 20 million new seeds this year out of 604 bushels. And design capacity, and I'm talking in terms of numbers of seed in terms of bushels, just because that's maybe easy for people to translate into numbers of seedlings. But design capacity for the extractory side is going to be about 20 million seeds a year. And the plan is to scale that in proportion to the nursery capacity. In terms of training, on that workforce development side, to date, over the last couple of years, we've trained over 350 seed collectors, tree planters, and other agency personnel on reforestation planning and tasks. So basically open for business for everything except the actual nursery. The biggest thing we've run into, and this is something that has kind of been alluded to in places today, but that, in my experience is going to be the wall that folks run into with implementation. You can build the best tool in the world, you can have the best science, best brains on it. And, if you're working with Forest Service, sometimes if you're working with tribal, sometimes private, doesn't matter what sector, what ownership you're working on, you run into folks where, the validity of the science doesn't matter. And it's been our experience that human dimension, that ability to navigate those personalities and the human landscape of what we do is just as much of a bottleneck for reforestation success and for scaling as any of the technical or scientific components. And that is, one of the main take homes that I want people to be thinking about, especially like everybody in here is brilliant on the technical side, brilliant on the science side. But, speaking for myself and I imagine for a lot of other folks, it's really that policy and human dimension bottleneck we run into. And our way around that, there's no easy, quick way around that. It's really just having those conversations, building those relationships, building that trust. And, a tool is not going to fix that. It's going to be about how we present that, how we, work that into the culture of the agencies, of the partners we're working with. And so, again, just upfront as you're embarking on this platform development, I would encourage folks to be thinking about how that happens. So in our case, that was a 5-year-long conversation with Forest Service. And it's ongoing, it's developing. We're still building those relationships. We're still building that capacity. But 5 years on now, we have a region-wide seed collection permit. We can, as far as I know, it's the only one that's been issued to date. And we can collect seed from any district on any forest in the region, including wilderness areas. We have a master participating agreement that covers the whole pipeline, the whole spectrum of reforestation activities to facilitate interoperability of our operations with Forest Service on Region 3 NFS lands. Haven't gotten a whole lot into the tribal side or the private side, but again, those tend to be easier from an access, from an operational standpoint. And the other thing I should mention is infrastructure. So again, coming out of those conversations, whereas on day one, when we started talking with Forest Service, it was, a whole lot of, well, we have, this laundry list of concerns. And then next year, similar deal, year after that, similar deal. But again, you keep having those conversations, building those relationships, working through, trying to understand it through their lens, through their policy, find those workarounds. And now, on the financial side, it's basically a 50-50 partnership funding this operation. And Forest Service has bought in, at this point, a $20 million stake in our infrastructure funding, which is absolutely huge. Lessons learned, we've already covered a lot of these. Be diplomatic, recognize that the humans are going to be a bottleneck as much as the technical stuff. Be nice, work through it. It's hard. It's really, really hard. And then finally, one thing we should build, getting to my actual scientific expertise, scientific a little bit, side a little bit. What I would really love to see in this is solid integration of the seed piece of the pipeline that is so often overlooked. I would be happy to talk with folks in depth on this, but I think it needs to integrate and project seed needs based on those reforestation acreage needs. Needs to be basically pulling in as near real time as possible seed inventory data from everybody that holds relevant seed resources and balancing those planting need acres against that inventory to come up with seed need that we can use to help run triage with our pretty limited collection resources. And then of course, part of that would be tying in our scouting and collection data, which we already have some apps that we've been playing with American Forest that they've been kind enough to help us develop on the scouting side. So with that, probably out of time, but we'll wrap it up and thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Going to do questions a little bit later. All right. Next up, we have Solomon Dabrowski. He's going to be talking to us about More Trees, Less Politics. I like it. It's brief. Perfect.
That's my subtitle. Thank you for the invite. I'm going to talk, kind of zoom out about work that I did with a kind of a motley crew of folks from agencies, from academia, from NGOs, from private industry as well. This is kind of an overview of a paper that we published last year that basically asks questions about what's the scope and scale of both the supply and demand side of the reforestation supply and the pipeline, if you will, focused on the Western US because there's been work done nationally. And this is kind of stepping away from my day job as an ecologist and kind of looking at this from a more holistic perspective. There's my arrows. There we go. Okay. I'm going to skip over a lot of high-level detail, but in the end, basically what we did is we looked at this from a post-fire focus. We looked at the MTBS record. We used existing work done by Brandon Collins and Michelle Bonanducci to look at fire size and core area relations. And we were really trying to put a number on, well, how much reforestation, post-fire reforestation need? Where do you have severe fire? Where are you over 100 meters out from viable seed sources? And we came up with a number that puts it in at around basically 6 million acres. And so there was a number that was thrown out earlier about the Forest Service nationally. Well, we're coming up with 6 million acres using a simple model for just the Western US. Since then, I've had a grad student actually look at individual fires throughout the entire MTBS record, look at both high severity and moderate severity, pixel by pixel. Those areas that are in that category that are beyond 100 meters, you're looking at 10 million acres. If you push it out to 200 meters beyond where you have viable seed sources, you're looking at something like 6 million acres. Bottom line is there's a lot of potential reforestation need out there. We don't need to gnash our teeth too much more about it other than that I think current estimates are low. Mind you, this is for all of both national forest lands, private lands, and everything in between. We also wanted to look at our ability to kind of fill those needs, so capacity. And so we start with basically the only legitimate data we have west-wide, which is basically surveys of seedling production at nurseries. In the last 10 years, we average about 142 million seedlings per year in production. And given that seedling growth is not done speculatively usually, seedlings produced generally can be translated into acres planted through various assumptions. The next important point here is that over 80% of that production is done by the private sector. And I would note that there aren't many people in the audience right here that are from the private sector. So if we're going to talk about scaling, we need to be in conversations with these folks. We did some survey work to try to understand, well, what proportion of that seedling production is going into the post-fire environment. I have some stats there, we can talk about it. But bottom line is what we did is we said, look, certain portion of this is going towards what we'll call operational forestry. So all that compliance reforestation after harvesting, mostly done by private industry. And what's left, we came up with a number about 84,000 acres per year is what we think both the Forest Service, private and state agencies are putting into post-fire reforestation. Now, to give you some context, we look at the facts database since about 2015, and we estimate that the Forest Service is planting on average about 9,000 acres per year in post-fire environments. So to give you some idea as to how that sits against these numbers. And all of these are estimates, of course. So if we take that 80,000 acres per year, which is that dashed line across the bottom, and we look at the annual needs, you basically can look at a cumulative gap, and we pin that gap in around 4 million acres. My guess is this is conservative. My guess is that there is actually more need out there than what I'm showing here. And this is just once again for the Western US. We project that out into the future. We expect a 2x going out to about 2050. My expectation is that's conservative as well, because big 5 years don't really align with ensemble projections. And when we look at those needs and capacity over the West, we see an important story, which I think needs to be noted here. 95% of the seedling production happens in 3 states, California, Oregon, and Washington. Those 3 states constitute about 50% of the post-fire reforestation need. So you have all these interior states that are basically not in geographic proximity to where a lot of seedling production has been produced. And Josh just mentioned some really heroic efforts going on in the Southwest to kind of ameliorate that issue. So what do we know? Well, we have a good handle on post-fire reforestation needs. When I say good handle, I'll put that in quotes. We got good data to say, okay, here's where we need it. Fire's quite visible from space. We can map that. What we don't understand, though, is what's being planted, how much is being planted, where it's being planted, and most importantly, the outcomes of those efforts. And so we have a good understanding of the demand, but we don't really know what's actually going into that pipeline and how those outcomes are translating. What's one thing we should build? Well, I suggest we need tools and database to track reforestation project inputs and outcomes. What do the inputs look like? Well, we've heard some of them today. Location, GPS coordinate location, not like an elevation zone or a seed zone. We need information about location. We need species, we need density estimates, we need seed lots, we need all that stuff that's going into these prescriptions. Thank you for the 1 minute. On the backside, in terms of outcomes, we need, what are the outcomes? What's the survivorship? What are the growths of those plantings look like? Given that I'm challenged with math, I'm actually going to give you 2 things as opposed to just the one thing. I have a grad student who's been basically building capacity to run forces on projects in burns all across the Western US. Here's one for the Lolo Peak fire that was mentioned earlier. And so we have the capacity to basically do this kind of work, looking at seedling availability, climate suitability, and costs associated with distance to roads. I'll leave it at that. What we're trying to do then is see what we can learn from those efforts of what's worked and what's not. And I'll stop there.
Thanks all. Thanks, Alman. We've got 2 more in this section. So up next, Brian Morris. He's going to be talking to us about reforestation and the fact that need does not equal demand. So thanks, Brian.
Thanks. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with the reforestation need.
After you're here for this, do you mind staying in front of the video so that, yeah.
I wasn't here for that part. And bear with me. I have a teething infant and I had to catch a really early flight, so I'm underslept and overcaffeinated. Again, talk about reforestation need and demand. We've been talking a lot of science research recently. I'm coming at this from a forester turned academic, turned silviculturist, turned nursery manager, turned program facilitator. I don't know what I do now, but that's where we're looking at it from. So really tying into what all those just talking about, there's increasing reforestation need on the landscape. We're seeing bigger fires, more frequent fires, and that our reforestation capacity is not keeping up with what we identify as that need. The image there on the right is from Solomon's paper. The image there on the left is some work that Charlie, Libby, and some others at American Forest have been doing in partnership with the state of Washington, looking at east side of the Cascades in Washington State, different GCMs and showing kind of regardless increasing post-fire reforestation need throughout the next decade. Century, not decade, sorry about that. So some other work we've done looking at what is that reforestation need on the landscape. Brian Rattini this morning mentioned the Fremont-Waunema National Forest. We did a post-fire reforestation assessment with them and found upwards of 230-ish thousand acres in that landscape in need of reforestation. I believe about 200 some odd thousand of that was on NFS lands. I believe currently they're planting about 5,000 acres a year in that landscape. So 225,000 acres, 5,000 acres a year. Not going to do the math right now, but it's a long time before we get there. The high probability is we're going to get more fires on the landscape before we hit that. So reforestation demand. So we've been talking reforestation need. Need has been what we've been talking about based on these big kind of 30,000 foot view models. But reforestation demand is actually getting boots on the ground and doing the work to turn that reforestation need into seedling orders, into crews on the ground, boots on the ground, shovels in the ground, and getting seedlings in the ground. From the Fremont-Waunema work we did, we found roughly 80 positions that would need to be created to ramp them up to about 15,000 acres of planting a year. If we expand that to the US, that's roughly 1,700 people, new positions, just on NFS lands, National Forest System lands, nationwide, to start turning that need into demand. Those are my napkin calculations. Some numbers I've heard from various regions of the Forest Service, as well as some national numbers they say are not terribly far off of that. Those are, again, positions needed to turn need into demand. So if we start talking about what the demand looks like, we're doing some work surveying reforestation service providers and nurseries across Oregon, Washington, and really everyone who serves those places. So it's really nurseries from Canada to California, being that British Columbia is actually a large producer of seedlings for Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. When we look at what we're getting out of the nurseries, was it 38% of nurseries are greater than 75% of container capacity, but they're not at full capacity. When we talk to reforestation service providers, the vast majority of them are very interested in increasing the amount of work they do. Even when I was managing a nursery at the height of the pandemic in early 2021, we started asking our contractors if they could increase capacity, if they could get more crews, more people. Yes. When do you want them? Tell me when you want them here, and we will have them here. We will have more people here. That's what I heard over and over and over again. The problem is we don't have the boots on the ground to create that demand, to get those people there, to get them working. The quotes on the left are some that came out of that recent survey. Historically, the nursery has added capacity to meet market demand. We have land and resources to do so again if the seedling demand requires it. We are waiting for market demand to increase before expanding more. We hear a lot about future increase in demand. We were not seeing any increase in orders yet. I've been hearing this nonstop for the last 5 years, 4 years, whatever it's been since the Fargione paper came out. Nonstop, I've been hearing about this. I get calls from Canada, nurseries in Canada, Oregon, Washington, California. Hey, do you guys have any orders you can send our way? Over and over and over again. So reforestation need versus demand. Need does not equal demand. I think that's something we need to be very, very careful about how we communicate that to the public, because people are looking to those of us in this room and in this meeting as the leading experts in this field, and they're going to make decisions based on what we say and how we communicate it. Producers want to expand. They have the land, they have the resources. Managers and researchers, that's us and say Forest Service, state agencies, we all cite this capacity limit. But the reality is the capacity limit is within the land manager and not within the service providers or the nursery, because they are willing to expand. They will expand if we provide the orders, if we provide long-term supply agreements, those sorts of things. Within the nursery world, low demand with high capacity is exactly what happened in 2009, 2010, when we saw nurseries close across the Northwest. So nurseries are very hesitant to increase capacity, just invest in infrastructure, invest in more people when they don't have a guaranteed demand, because that's what led to their peers closing down in 2009, 2010. Also, it's an international market. for a variety of reasons, we really focus on whatever our geographic references of choice, the state, the county, the nation, Forest Service region, whatever it may be. But we can't ignore seedling producers to the north. When I worked in the state of Washington, we purchased millions of trees every year from nurseries, primarily in the Okanagan Valley, British Columbia, that were shipped out. Best ponderosa pine seedlings I've ever seen. Just saw this article the other day, BC tree planting to plummet 23% amid wildfire boom. So that's going to be extra capacity available. I will say I've not vetted that article, just what I saw the other day pop up. While I'm on the topic of nurseries, one of the things I've not heard mentioned as we've been talking about seedling research and all that is stock type and nursery effect. Picture on the top right, those are all the same stock type, all the same seed lot. And you'll notice that the trees on the left are much, much taller than the trees on the right. That's because we were playing with different ways of treating those trees in the nursery to produce different desired characteristics in the nursery. The bar graph at the bottom is the data from those different treatments showing that we can produce very, very different trees with the same genetics, the same stock type, just by doing different things in the nursery. I will say in this study, it was a 1 year kind of operational study. We did not see survival differences. We did see some growth differences. But what we did see in the 2 outplanting sites is we had like 100% survival in one and like 0 survival in another, which if you're trying to understand the difference between different treatments and survival, you want like 50% to survive, not 100% and not 0, which is what we saw. So what we know, and this is going to go a little bit back to the seedling thing, we know we need people. We know we need people to turn that need into demand. From my experience, I also know the target plant concept is crucial to actually getting stuff on the ground and getting it to survive. That taking the tools that we have, talking about climate moisture deficit, talking about everything that Carlos was talking about with cavitation resistance and all that, and using that through trained, smart, educated, good people on the ground with their boots dirty, working with their nursery, working with their service providers to make sure that we are producing the best tree we possibly can to survive. You can see drastic survival differences just by the tree you ship to the woods. I think the other day in a meeting, I made a comment. It was kind of I may have been partially confused when I said it, but it kind of landed in that a dead tree has really low chances of survival. And so if we're shipping trees that are less than ideal to the woods, they're not going to do well. So one last little piece, and this is not necessarily what we could build in terms of landscape, but I figured when I looked at the people who are going to be in the room, a lot of academic folks in here, a lot of university folks. One of the things that I've picked up from a talk I gave a little while ago, this paper is from 2022 and looked at dissertation topics from 1978 to 2017. That red circle highlights forest soil nutrients ecology, forest soil nutrients ecology and management, as well as the line that drops fastest is tree seedling propagation, physiology, and propagation. Those dissertation topics have plummeted. So if we need to hire thousands of people in the next couple of years, but we're not doing the research to train the faculty to train these people, how are we going to increase that demand and actually turn that need into demand if we're not creating the young professionals to do that? One last little piece, the reforestation pipeline does need GED to PhD, so not everyone needs to go through those programs. There's other ways to get there. That is super important, but I think this is a start.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. All right. Last but not least, before our next break, we've got Matt Hurto, who's going to be talking about deploying a data-informed approach to reforestation. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to get my timer going so I don't get in the way of people getting coffee. So thanks for the invite. You know, I was thinking as I was putting this together about when I first got to New Mexico. I went out in the footprint of the Las Conchas fire, which was 2011, with Craig Allen, who's been working in the Jemez landscape for better part of 30 plus years. And we were cruising along, and that was kind of the first fire that happened in New Mexico that was kind of representative of this climate changed world. There was a plume collapse about 2 a.m. And it caused, hot river of gases to go downslope and basically cooked everything down to the ground. And so it was pretty impactful from an ecological perspective. And we were out there, and basically we were out to look at the kind of fire ecology, the fire effects. And then we saw some planted seedlings, and Craig told me that the Forest Service had repeatedly planted this area and that survival rates were, insignificant, right? So basically, I think I saw the number of live trees I could count on both hands that day. And I was thinking, well, there's got to be a better approach to doing this, right? So, that led to thinking about how we might go about that work. We saw this paper from Jessie Utz in 2015. And she, for her graduate work, had sampled a number of fires across Arizona and New Mexico and found region-wide planted seedling survival averaged 25%, which, I think in the footprint of the Las Conchas fire, that would be a big win. And because we're much lower than that. And so, that led to working on a proposal that fall of 2015 to Joint Fire Science Program to try and tackle this issue. And so, but part of the reason we see low survival is this image here captured by Chris Marsh, who's here in the audience. Chris is as obsessed with this topic as a bunch of us, and would be happy to talk to you about the work we're doing too. But this is from Las Conchas fire, and it shows maximum temperatures captured at 44 degrees Celsius. We've measured soil surface temperatures of 60 degrees C and higher, which are lethal, right? And so Solomon had a student several years ago publish a review paper looking at physiological mortality or thermal stress in seedlings, and you're not going to survive that, right? If you're a tree seedling. And so this is one of the challenges that we're facing in these environments. And so anyway, we set out this experiment because I was thinking, like, I look at like the approach that gets taken is this, like, go out and plant 300 trees per acre on a 10-meter grid is the plant and pray approach in the Southwest. And it's like, well, if we stick enough in the ground, hopefully some of them will survive, right? And I think that given the seed shortages we've heard so much about, the capacity shortages we've heard so much about, it's probably a poor approach. And so we started tackling this from the perspective of how to think about the microclimatic conditions the seedlings experiencing, and how can we predict those across the landscape. So we planted a bunch of seedlings stratified by aspect, and we measured relative humidity and soil moisture and stuff like that. And then basically what we found, and this paper was published by led by Chris in 2022, was that if we have information pertaining to survival data, and so like Solomon was saying, and I would reinforce that, we need really good survival, or we need really good success data, right? Did they survive? Did they die? And precise coordinates were important for this modeling effort. And we couple that with a digital elevation model. In this area, we've got a 1 meter DEM and solar radiation information. We're able to predict the probability a planted seedling survives in a square meter area with 63% accuracy, which is a great leap forward relative to where we're currently at when we started this work. And so I think the thing I want to point out, so this is this figure on the right is just a part of that Las Conchas fire footprint. And I'd like to point out those little white dots on there are all validation data. So those were Forest Service planted reforestation effort that Chris and Kevin in the lab went out and collected data on. But this map shows the probability of planted seedling survival. So white is 100%, black is 0. And if you look where most of those white dots are, right, they're not in a place in this landscape we're likely to see high success. And so this gets back to one of the earlier comments about starting to think holistically about how to get this done and be willing to walk away from certain areas. So, if thinking about like what we need to build, right? What we really need is a back end that can ingest all kinds of data and update predictions, right? We need to do this in the context of providing an interface where people enter those survival data that Solomon was talking about, where we've got coordinates, species, time of planting, all that stuff. And then we can assimilate that information to make new predictions in new geographies for new species using a similar framework, right? And then that back end needs to be flexible enough to incorporate all kinds of additional data. So some of the things that that we were just talking about in terms of like the physiology things, right? So those studies, as they come into play for particular species, that kind of information can be assimilated into a machine learning model. We've got a student right now working on trying to understand soil impacts on seedling survival, right? That information can be assimilated. And so the real point of all of this is like we should hoover up all the data that we can and use it to make improved predictions so that we can lessen some of the constraints on seedling production and seed collection that we're currently facing. And then the more of the seedlings that we plant on the landscape will survive to achieve, desirable outcomes. Thanks.